Well, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Welcome to our very third stream of the third iteration of Journalism Under Fire. My name is Sandy Campbell. I'm the Executive Director of the Santa Fe Council on International Relations. I want to send a really special welcome to all the students we have joining us tonight from the University of Limerick. Welcome from UCLA, and from across New Mexico, from UNM down south to Deming. So welcome. I'm really glad you could join us. Let me quickly just point out on our website, journalismundefire.org/students, you'll find our news literacy modules. These are 4 different modules that really just help us all learn the kinds of skills and insights we need to interact effectively in this often bizarre media world. Touching on things like fake news and mis and disinformation, we have a nice explainer of digital forensics and really highlight some of Malachy's work in those modules as well. So that's at journalismundefire.org/students. And again, welcome. Quick little piece of housekeeping. We have another session tonight. It starts at 5:30 p.m. It's Dana Priest of the Washington Post. You may have seen her last night interviewing Nick Kristof. And Dana's going to be interviewing tonight E.J. Dionne, who is a opinion columnist for the Washington Post as well. And he is going to walk us behind the scenes into this last week of electoral uncertainty, which I guess if we're reading the headlines now, we're still in some electoral uncertainty. So again, join us tonight. All the talks are on journalismundefire.org. If you're a student, of course, you are soundly welcome, and it's always free for you and for teachers and for journalists as well. And we hope to have as many of you joining us as we can. So with all of that out of the way, let me introduce today's speaker, Malachy Browne. Welcome, Malachy.
Hey, Sandy. Thank you very much.
Thanks for coming. It's been a year almost. We of course had you come out to Santa Fe last year in 2019.
Yep, that's right. It was great.
So Malachy, Malachy, of course, is a native of Limerick, as many of you know, and a senior producer of the New York Times Visual Investigations Unit. And honestly, your work I follow really closely. It feels like the future of journalism, even though, of course, it's very much in the present. And when we think about all the data we're endlessly creating, it seems inevitable that journalism would catch up with that and use that data to really, the open source data to really kind of understand what in the world's going on, from using CCTV footage to cell phone data and tower pings and on, and even using Twitter in that particular way. And it's pretty fascinating. Let me ask you, Malachy, I've got 2 questions for you.
Yeah.
First question is, since you left Santa Fe in May of this year, you and your team won the Pulitzer Prize for international reporting for, quote, a series of enthralling stories reported at great risk, exposing the predations of Vladimir Putin's regime. What does it feel like to win a Pulitzer Prize?
Yes, at the time it was thrilling, really, but I've kind of forgotten about it now, and you kind of get on with the work at hand, you know what I mean? But it was great to be part. We were part of a sort of a group effort, if you like. Michael Schwartz and Dion Sarsi and David Kirkpatrick, who also were looking at Russia's activities in Europe, in Libya, in Central Africa as well. And it was sort of part of that whole series of work on Russia last year that we were very grateful to be entered for the prize and awarded it. Anyway.
Well, congratulations, richly deserved. I have one other question for you before I turn the floor over to you, which is, when you think back on your time in Santa Fe, I know it was only a few days, but
yeah,
in the conference, anything that jumps out at you or that sticks in the mind that you'd like to share with us today?
I mean, it was really, it was my first time at Santa Fe last year at the conference, and I was struck by sort of the breadth of experience that was there, and smarts, and people from all around the world. It was just fantastic to hear from them their experiences, and also the theme of misinformation and disinfo was just spot on. Looking at what we're going through this week, I mean, really, it was remarkable, and it's been a focus, I think, of a lot of newsrooms And so that was one other thing that struck me about the conference, how forward-looking it was, and really sort of capturing something before it really took hold in a domestic way.
Yep. Fascinating speakers last year. Last year, of course, we asked the big question, how is technology shaping the truth? And of course, your work has an awful lot to say about how all the different types of technology can help us sort of piece together the truth. Um, so I think on that note, I'm going to switch my screen off, turn it all over to you. Welcome. And I'll just tell people one more thing. Type in your questions in the Q&A box. And there'll be some time, about 15 minutes at the end of Malachy's presentation, when we'll dive into some questions. Don't hold back. Ask some great ones. So thanks very much. And over to you, Malachy.
Okay, thanks very much, Sandy. So what I'm going to do is go through, present the series of investigative reports that were part of that prize last year. And one thing I should say about it actually is like the value of that sort of recognition is that it brings focus back onto that work if it's lost at the time that it's published, and kind of creates, you know, an emphasis on it in a lasting way as well, I think. And these are pretty serious crimes that the UN finally now calls crimes, war crimes, and has attributed blame to Russia. And it was a series of investigations into attacks on hospitals and healthcare, and also other civilian sites in Syria. Russia had long been suspected of carrying out these airstrikes, and if you talk to anybody in Syria, you know, they would say, well, we know it's a Russian warplane that carried out that airstrike because the sound of it, the model of it, the shape of it, then you can look up and see what type of aircraft it is, and the power of the weaponry that they had as well. And they also had a network of flight spotters, which we'll get into, which was a fundamental part of this investigation. And they would observe what the Russian planes were doing. But of course, Russia, through all of this, despite having a seat at the table of negotiations on transition of power or ceasefires or all of that, and sitting at the United Nations Security Council, they ardently or very forcefully denied, you know, any involvement in attacks on civilians throughout the Syrian conflict. And so it was very hard to pin anything with you know, irrefutable evidence on the Russians. And so that's what we managed to do in this series. And I'll go through the reporting methods, and then also sort of like how we broadened it out and presented the stories as well in a variety of different formats. So with that, I'll just share my screen and stop rabbiting on and get into it. Hopefully you can see this, can you?
Yep, we can see that perfectly.
Yeah, you can see it. So as I said, the whole series was about healthcare and civilians under attack in Syria. And these were sort of the first four investigations that we did, or three investigations and a Times Insider, which is kind of like a blog post describing the reporting. But it broadened out, as I said, into a whole series where, which you can find at this URL. Visual Investigations has its own page on the New York Times, and there's a sort of a playlist, if you like, of all of our reports, which are a mix of videos, interactives, and you know, straight print pieces as well, a photo essay in there too. But it broadened out from these first stories where we found Russian pilots had bombed 4 hospitals in the space of 12 hours in one day, and then came back and a few weeks after we had published our investigation and bombed one of those very same hospitals again, if you can believe that. And then we looked at civilian sites. Yeah, the 2 of the worst attacks in Syria last year. One was on a camp for displaced people, and the second one was on a Marat of Numan at around 8 o'clock in the morning, 9 a.m., near a market area, a busy commercial area in the morning, where again, dozens of people were killed in repeated airstrikes. When we broadened it out, we looked at back to the early days, even before Russia was involved in this conflict, at medics and how they had been targets of the Syrian regime. And we also looked at the UN too, because we found problems with their systems to protect hospitals and other civilian sites. And we also discovered in the course of our reporting that Russia were trying to quieten down an investigation that the UN itself launched into attacks on these sites. They became so bad that the UN, which had been dragging its heels, finally announced an investigation. The UN Secretary General did, but Russia pressured him to keep it private. And also, there was some question over, you know, how those incidents, they only chose 7 incidents to investigate, when we know that like 70 or more hospitals were hit last year. Um, and we also then looked at the effect of that, the biggest exodus of people from their homes in Idlib and Hama north into the northwest of the country as a result of the bombing. And we finally, when there was a ceasefire called, got on the ground in Syria. But this started with, obviously observing this and observing reports out of Syria, but really kind of like dull old research, if you like, and talking to the various different organizations who were monitoring attacks and documenting attacks on hospitals and collecting all of their data, sifting through it, finding, coordinates and looking at satellite imagery and collecting evidence for all of these attacks, and then creating our own master database of attacks, if you like. And by the time we really focused in on this, there was we pulled together a team of, in total, it was 9 people who were a core kind of reporting team of 5 translators, and Russian and Syrian translators, people who had sources in the Syrian military and the former Soviet pilots. And then the storytelling, the video editors and the motion graphics folks who helped bring these stories to life and really explain them, because they're very technical in the detail. And so just to explain this to you, the date of the attack, the time of the attack, which was really critical to us, as I'll explain, and then links out to working documents for each of these incidents, what the facility is called in Arabic, what organization supports them, whether they're deconflicted or not. And what that means is, are they on a no strike list that the UN collected and distributed to the military partners, to the military parties rather, in Syria. The UN didn't make that public, but through our reporting, we managed to get a fairly good list of sites that had been deconflicted. That was important because, warring parties are supposed to take precautions not to hit hospitals or schools or bakeries or infrastructure anyway. But if they're given this list with coordinates and they're repeatedly hitting these places that are supposed to be protected, then you have to have questions, about the efficacy of the list and the deconfliction mechanism, but also whether that list was actually being used as a list of targets. And so the opposite of what it was intended. And so this is just a really crude screenshot of us laying out all of our evidence for various different locations, for the sites of hospitals, the sites where the position of a camera person when they took a video or a photograph that was important, mapping out topographical details like minarets and water towers that allow us to verify where the angles of those videos and what have you. And in the course of our reporting, we came to understand how these early warning systems worked in Syria. There's a network of observers in Syria that listen into the radio frequencies that the pilots, the Syrian and the Russian pilots, use when they're conducting their missions. And what they're doing is they're listening in, but they're also on rooftops and out in the street, and they're observing the planes, and they're reporting back and logging all of this in a database that automatically tweets out what type of aircraft, where it's spotted, which direction it's going in, et cetera, et cetera. And you get, all of that has timestamps. And that was a really rich data set for us. In establishing what aircraft were active in what areas around the time of the attacks that we were investigating. And so you can see all of these different Syrian towns here, the province that they're in, what type of aircraft it is, fixed wing, and what direction it's heading in. And what's missing here is the timestamp, actually, but there was another column with the hour and minute that these were being reported. But we also found in investigating one of our attacks that the Russian audio and the Syrian pilot audio was being recorded and also timestamped and saved somewhere, because when we were investigating one attack, somebody had said, well, we know, a witness said, we know it was Russian. How do you know it's Russian? Well, because we have the audio transcript. And so then through our sourcing, we got access to that database of all of these really short 10-second, 5-second, 6-second recordings of Russian pilots anytime they would come on the airwaves and drop off again. And so they're exchanging commands with ground control. And that really was a massive break in the story for us, because, in many instances, they didn't use coordinates, but sometimes they did. Coordinates are shared with the pilots, usually electronically, or they're pre-programmed in before a bombing run happens. But over the airways, you could also hear them exchanging coordinates, correcting them, repeating them back. And in fact, when we looked at one day of the first day of airstrikes of this audio that we looked at on May 5th, I think there were 80 something strikes, and there were 21 or 22 where the coordinates were used. And so in order to verify the source material that we were getting, one exercise that we did is we went back over before and after satellite imagery for each of these coordinates. And indeed, you could see that those sites had been attacked. And so we knew this was legitimate audio, because it would be impossible to scan around for the precise coordinates using satellite imagery and then sort of concoct these reverse engineer these audio recordings, if you know what I mean. And this one is an underground hospital in God, I can't remember which one it is, but anyway, it was an underground hospital that was built outside of the town. Hospitals were so frequently attacked that they started to build them underground, where they could, out on the outskirts of towns and villages. And so this is one of them. They had got up the early warning system. They got out and they put their cameras on it and captured it. And so one of the tasks for us was to transcribe all of these commands. And that took us many weeks, if not months. But we found a pattern in the audio that they would receive their package. They would get a correction on it. They would confirm the correction on it. They would get 3 sevens, which is a green light to proceed with their bomb. And then they would report back and say, Srabotal. They would say, I sent it. And they would also give, before they attack, they would give the minute that they were going to attack as well. They would sometimes say sent puck, or sometimes they would say sent candy. And they had all these different code words. And they also had code words for the areas in Syria in which they were attacking. And so we got a really in-depth appreciation and understanding of how the Russians and the Syrians were operating. And there were funny exchanges sometimes between the Russians talking about the Syrian pilots getting in their way and at the wrong level and all that kind of stuff as well. So there was a little bit of bitching going on in the skies as well about each other. So you really got all of this sort of granular context. Anyway, so one of the attacks, just to show you how then we were able to pair the Russian audio with uh, video evidence, visual evidence of the attacks. This is Kafarnaba Hospital that was bombed on November 6th. And you can see this is CCTV. Although it was dug underground at this point, it once stood overground and then they finally had to dig underground. This is a hospital that has been bombed many times, has been refurbished by the WHO with funding from the Japanese government, among other governments, but it keeps getting bombed. And they eventually installed CCTV camera, and it was hit 3 times in this particular attack, 5 minutes apart. And every time it was hit, the ground shudders, the place fills with smoke, and the CCTV captures that moment. And that was really important because it had a timestamp. And so for each of those 3 strikes, we were able to extract the timestamp from the CCTV, and then see what was going on in the skies at that time. And so you have Pilot 31 confirming Srabotal, 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 circling around, bombing it with a precision weapon each time. And there was a discrepancy here between the minutes, but that mattered less to us than the interval, because we felt that they could be 2 different clock systems, and we were able to prove that that was the case actually afterwards, before we published, but after we had done this analysis, that precisely 5 minutes 54 seconds, 5 minutes 58 seconds. I think one of them might be off by 2 seconds. You hear the pilot confirming that he has struck his target, which is the hospital, which you see shaking at that time. There's no other airstrikes going on at that time either. And so we went back to the hospital and said, could you hold your iPhone up to the security system when it changes its minute? And so the iPhone kind of became our yardstick, if you like, because we could see that their iPhone matched the time on our iPhone, when we were exchanging WhatsApp messages over and back. And then when they recorded, it said, "Oh yeah, our clock is a little bit. Our security system is a few minutes behind." So that was that. And then consulting the pilot logs, you could see that there's, at the time of those strikes, there's aircraft logged in Kafarnavel, and attacking aircraft in the air, in the sky at that time. Just to give you a sense of like the recordings, the pilot recordings. So these were like voluminous files. Again, just going back to data, like knowing how to manage data on spreadsheets became really useful for this, and also thinking in innovative ways about how to process, a mass dump of audio files like this, because there's no way around it but to listen to it, and to translate it. And so this is what it looks like. We're getting these short snippets, the time that they're sent. This is our own column, whether we've listened to it or not, what the translation is. And then we're pulling out any coordinates, and then the pilot and the ground control code names that we're able to decipher from their communications. And this is just one snippet of one day. And you can see like all of the other days we had here, we literally had, tens of thousands of lines of audio to go through. And we've found a way to, one of our data reporters and engineers, Bowie, all of the other master databases plus this master database, he kind of created a way for us to be able to search through them and link them together, which proved to be kind of helpful. But also with all of this audio, because they're really short snippets, Dmitry, one of our Russian video editors, he just strung them all out. And usually they're like in the audio waveform. If you can imagine the audio waveform, you're usually getting really short kind of conversations. Yeah, over and back, short conversations. But when they read out coordinates, there's a pattern to that, because it's usually, and it's usually the same length of time. And so he could scan through, and our translators could scan through that audio for a day and try to get coordinates, because coordinates were sort of like the golden eggs, really. We can check very precisely if that points at a hospital or another facility, and we can use satellite imagery and our own sort of open source sleuthing to try to gather evidence and see if that was attacked at that time on that day. And then once we're investigating all of these incidents. Christian and Evan and the team were looking at the models of the aircraft that are in the videos that we can see. They educated themselves and talked to experts in the Russian military and the Syrian military about what aircraft they had. Christian actually had a sort of a visual glossary of all the different aircraft on his desk, and what the models were, what their capabilities were, what they looked like, whether the wings were fixed or they could be pinned back, what color camouflage, etc. So we're doing that, as I said, before and after satellite imagery analysis of the sites that were bombed. And then we're also looking at the type of weapons that are used, whether they're delay fuse, bunker busters, all of that kind of stuff, precision missiles, if they hit the same target at the exact same place, which means that their precision and they have the coordinates. They're able to attack a particular coordinate, or whether they are the Syrian army or military, for instance, would or less likely to use those and come in and drop several bombs less precisely. A lot of this was doing. I was listening to Dana Priest last night, and she was talking about getting on the ground and talking to people, and there is no there's nothing really that beats that, and getting a sense for the story when you're on the ground. But the most of this reporting was done remotely. We had no choice. The Times is very conservative about going into active war zones like you had in Syria, and with good reason, because a number of journalists have been lost over the years in going to, particularly to Syria. But technology and secure communications and building a very good source network over years of doing this enabled us to get in touch with witnesses and collect evidence directly from them. And that was key because that gave us metadata. So we're turning people who are posting videos to Twitter and to YouTube and elsewhere from open sources into primary sources. And the value of that is that although somebody might post a video an hour later or 2 hours later or the next day of an attack, that's good visuals to have, but it doesn't have the hour, minute, and second that video was recorded unless you get the original file. And so usually a camera or a cell phone will record that. And by getting all of that, by figuring out if their cameras were off, we can calculate exactly when that attack happened and relate what happened on the ground with what was going on in the sky and match those pilots with those attacks. And that was really what cracked that first investigation for us. But also, once we're talking to people, we're like, can you send us the message? Once we find witnesses, doctors who are working in hospitals, their security teams who are advising them on hospitals are receiving messages from their network, or the supporting organizations as well, their incident reports and the messages that they were getting, all of that contained valuable information as well. And so what you're seeing on screen here is, messages sent by one of the doctors who was in one of the hospitals being bombed, and he's reporting back that at 3:15, Sukhoi 35 hit us with a missile. These are the messages that he was sending on the day, and we're interviewing him weeks later. And so we're able to verify those messages, and that also then just gives us a timestamp as well. All very sort of detailed, forensic, hard evidence. And not one piece of this evidence by itself cracks the case, but you're stacking it, one atop of the other and cross-corroborating it and all of that kind of stuff. Of course, talking to the director of SAMS, the Syrian American Medical Society, Susanna Sirkin, at Physicians for Human Rights, who have been documenting and monitoring this and talking about this for years, going over to the UN and confronting the Syrian ambassador Jafari, and again just having conversations with dozens and dozens of witnesses, as Evan Hill and Christian and Yusra Al-Hlu, when we first started reporting this, all did. And so that all gave us incredible context. Another example, and just once we kind of got our process in place, we were able to more quickly investigate attacks as they were happening. And so I'm just going to bring you through these two pretty awful attacks that, as I said at the start, the UN now calls war crimes committed by Russia, which is an unusual step for them. And so this one is the first one I'm going to talk about is this remote um, refugee camp, IDP, internally displaced persons camp in Idlib, where dozens of families resided. They had already been uprooted by war. It's isolated out in the middle of nowhere, no military target or objective in the area from our reporting, and yet it was bombed. Using satellite imagery, we were able to kind of show the front line as it ebbs and flows, and how far away this particular camp was from the front line, and yet it was bombed. And the key piece of evidence for us, there were plenty of videos, really horrific videos of the aftermath of that attack, but none in the moment, apart from this one photograph that existed. And we found the person who took that photograph, got the raw photograph from them, checked their camera settings, and were able to establish the minute that it was taken. We're also able to confirm through drone footage and satellite imagery where it was taken, where the camera was pointed, and that in fact it does show the camp. It looks like just a plume of smoke, but when you zoom in on the detail of where the smoke is coming from, you can see the aerial, the mast atop the roof, the orientation and the number of windows along the camp as well. And so this is footage that was taken after the attack as well, and that did have some value. You can see at sunset, you can see the size of the crater, you can see the force of the blast leveled all of the buildings around, which gives you a number of clues as to the weaponry that was used. But the metadata from this was really critical, because we can say that the photograph was taken at 7:17 p.m. We can find out when sunset was as well by online sun calculators and what have you. And then by checking our flight logs, we can see that there was a Russian aircraft spotted in the area at the time. And then exactly at 7:17, at the start of that minute, we've got a Russian pilot confirming that he bombed his target. There are no other bombings going on from our reporting at that time. Second thing is Marad al Numan, 4 airstrikes in the morning before 9 a.m. Similar method. One of the first videos that we found was a local media activist who's running down the street to the site of an attack. And as he's running down, you can hear over the radio, he reaches the area where there's already first responders, emergency responders, and you can hear on their microphone to get a warning that the warplane is in the sky and it's about to bomb again. His camera flashes up. We were able to build this scene of on the ground of what was going on, the communications that were going on in the sky. And so the pilot's conversations as these guys are frantically rushing to the scene, but then running for cover as he bombs again repeatedly. And, part of our investigation obviously meant going over to the UN, listening into Security Council meetings. This is an emergency one that was called on Syria because hospitals had been bombed so frequently that they started to name the hospitals that were on their no strike list, which was a highly unusual step for them, just to draw attention to the fact. But also you have Mark Lowcock here, casting doubt on whether their whole deconfliction system is worth it at all in this particular meeting. And then, going over and sitting in meetings where they're announcing other measures as well. This one on the right-hand side is when they were announcing the board of inquiry into 7, I think it was, strikes on protected facilities in Syria. Um, and Whitney Hurst, who was on the reporting team and was also senior producing this with me, she has reported in the UN for many years, is well sourced in there, and she, through her sourcing, discovered that Russia had put pressure on the UN to keep the findings of their inquiry private. And, you know, she also, through her sourcing, managed to get the list of incidents that they were investigating. And so we did our own investigation into that, very detailed. Instead of producing it as a video, we produced this as an interactive, and we laid all of the evidence out there so that it was being put into the public domain. The first one that we're looking at is a child protection center, a place where kids used to go to, and it was one of the sort of the few outlets for children in this war-torn city, Aria. I think it's the second biggest city in Idlib. And that was destroyed and put out of service, damaged and put out of service when the Syrian Air Force bombed an apartment block right beside it, 50 yards away from it, with 2 days, one after the other, which is really heinous. I mean, there were horrific scenes from those attacks. This is kind of how we did it. That's how I just want to show the presentation. So this is what it looked like in the website, and this is how we presented it in print. And so for each of these investigations, we've worked with our print hub to try to really show the visual evidence of what it means and highlight it in the same way that our motion graphics editors do in the videos that we produce. And so in the course of our reporting as well, we were talking to Physicians for Human Rights who got exclusive access to information about doctors who were detained, interrogated, tortured at the start of, in the early years of the conflict, because they were providing services in what were then rebel areas, I suppose, opposition controlled areas. And this is before the sort of the front lines became kind of locked in, when people were moving over and back across sort of like de facto lines, if you like, and they're picked up. And so that was also part of the series that we looked at, and the UN work, as I said. This particular story is about the deconfliction system because, as we're going through and confirming where hospitals were, the coordinates that are there, the supporting organizations, we realized that the UN they had mixed up some coordinates. Most of them now were correct, but it pointed to a problem with their deconfliction system and with their validation of the information that was coming to them and that they were then distributing. So they then appointed somebody to validate and I suppose quality control the information that they were sharing. And one of the things that we also looked at then as the bombardment and the military campaign kind of reached its height, was this mass exodus of people from Idlib and northern Hama, further north into up towards the Turkish border, and these massive sprawling camps that we were able to see grow in satellite imagery. But also we finally, User and Evan Hill, got on the ground and were able to document some of that. This was just as COVID was hitting as well, and so they were able to write about the concerns for those people living in those camps. And again, this was more of a tap-through interactive, a different format again, that we felt best suited this story. And one of the things that was really appalling about that is that even as people were fleeing, they continued to be bombed. And so we went to the site of, again, two of those attacks. One was on a school in Marat Nasreen, and this was on a poultry farm where several families had taken up shelter, which is bombed in the middle of the night. And this woman is still living in the ruins of that place and lost family members in that attack in February of this year. So again, just to show some of how we present this type of evidence, which is not sort of traditional story. So that's sort of it. If anybody has questions, I can happy to take them.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much. Fascinating. I'm going to lead off with a question that's a two-pronged question. And this is kind of building on a question asked by Ambassador Vicky Huddleston. I guess the first question is, how does your team decide particular stories to pursue? And the second part is, we know there are so many, crimes that go on that can't be seen or captured or have data captured on them, from, poaching of elephants to, a lot of the illegal fishing that, the Chinese and other countries engage in.
Yeah.
Are those possibilities, or walk us through sort of how these decisions are made in terms of what's covered?
Yeah, I mean, usually we will have a sort of a germ of an idea. In fact, the Syria one, sorry, my kids are running around there behind. The Syria one started actually a couple of years before we finally assembled a team to really go after it. And it was a tweet that I saw that said, that had a statistic that in a particular military campaign, you know, I think the hospitals were being hit every 29 hours over the course of 5 weeks, which is a shocking statistic, really, when you think about it. And it speaks to a deliberate campaign of targeting hospitals as part of the military strategy. And so that was the starting point. And then the question becomes, okay, can we find hard evidence, visual evidence around this? Will our take and what we do in the investigation do be original? And will it be revealing and impactful? So that's that's the framework that we have for almost every piece that we do. And it doesn't I mean, usually it's visual investigations is our team. And so the value of videos with the metadata means that it's hard evidence, it's indisputable evidence. So when you pair it with all of this other evidence, and present that transparently, there's a certain power to it. And so it goes beyond, you know, interviewing witnesses, or I mean, which is also a big part of what we do, but just relying on witness and then the government account or an official account of something. And it really kind of cuts between the two of those, or cuts through those. People misremember things all of the time as well. And so that's why we do it. But on the phishing stuff and on flight records and all of that. I mean, that can be a very strong element of an investigation too. For instance, when we were investigating the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, we were able to look at the flights that were coming into Istanbul and the time codes in the security camera footage for the key members of that team. And you're able to say, okay, well, they arrived in 3 different teams, and then another team came in, and then another team left. And it allows you to really break down and understand how the whole operation came together, who they were then, by trawling through sort of digital breadcrumbs they left on social media and Arabic news media and like academic papers. The doctor who dismembered him. He was an expert pathologist. Sort of all of this comes together, and you're able to very quickly see, okay, this wasn't an accident, it was very premeditated, and they assembled a team to go after him. On the phishing stuff, again, ships tend to turn off if they're up to something fishy. They turn off their transponders and their trackers and stuff like that very often, so it can be difficult. But Christoph Kottel, for instance, who's an expert in satellite imagery and is part of our team, he was able to, in conjunction with C4ADS in Washington, a sort of an intelligence agency, track an illegal shipment of Mercedes-Benz Kim Jong-un, and show how that network worked. And there's some evidence that these are dual-purpose networks for sanctions evasions. And it was a mixture of sort of tracking the ships, but when they went dark, seeing if you could find them in satellite imagery and that kind of stuff as well. And in satellite imagery tools, you can measure the actual size and dimensions of the ship. And sometimes you get satellites that are, taking pictures at that angle, and so you get the color of them. and think there's all these sorts of ways that you can interrogate and investigate those types of leads, if you like.
I want to ask you, because I think one of my favorite stories that your team has put out was the downing of the Ukrainian airline in Iran. Um, how did that story? I mean, did somebody discover some data, or were you sent security camera foot? I know security camera footage was a big part of that tracked the missile from the Iranian military base. Tell me a little bit about how that story came together.
Yeah, I mean, it happened on a Tuesday night, New York time. We were most of our team was up reporting at that time because, if you remember, Iran had launched missiles at US targets in Iraq and military bases in Iraq. And so we were reporting on that when suddenly there was a flash from Fars news agency that an airplane had been shot down in Tehran, or had crashed in Tehran. And so we started looking at that, really early on, collecting what we could. And just our process there, it was a mystery, but it was highly suspicious that it happened, when there were sort of heightened tensions. And very quickly we were able to map out in Google Earth um, the trajectory of the aircraft, where it went, where its signal was lost, and then start searching for in Farsi for anybody who was reporting tweets or on Telegram talking about events that were, happening in the here and now. And we found a couple of tweets where people were saying, "Oh, I heard two explosions in the sky. Oh, I just saw an airplane. It was in flames. It crashed down." And so again, you just start collecting and logging all of these little clues as to what's happening, and creating a mind map of what happened. Then videos. It was pre-dawn, and so videos started emerging of a fireball crashing down, and it kind of exploded, fell, and exploded again. And so, although it was pitch black, it was very difficult. So because it was pitch black, it was very difficult to find exactly where those videos were filmed. It took us a while. But what we were able to do, Christian Treber synchronized them to see, are these videos of the same thing from the intensity of the flashes and the explosion. And so we were comfortable that they were, and so we were able to run with those. And then as daylight emerged, we were in touch in real time with somebody who's walking the crash site and posting pictures. And this guy could speak English. He was posting pictures from the crash site. So we got evidence from him, and it was very much a breaking news application of this type of visual investigation. Mapping out where he was, we realized it's 10 miles away from where the signal was lost. And so it seemed that the plane had turned around and was heading back towards Tehran. And we were able to confirm that from more photographs as more photographers got on the scene, because you could see the blood spatter on one side of a concrete wall and not on the other. Or you could see a wall collapse from a piece of the plane's debris in one direction, and the tracks of the debris. So it was clearly going back towards Tehran. So it had circled back around. And so you're kind of stacking all of this up. And in the course of doing that, then there were little Telegram groups organized around reporting on the plane crash, but also for the towns and villages around that area. Parand was one of them, and it had its own Telegram group. And so Dimitri was monitoring, Christian was monitoring that at lunchtime 2 days later. And sorry, just before, just explain this, we're mapping all of this out in Google Earth, by the way. So we've also mapped out where the Iranian missile sites are that the planes were flying in. We're checking the historical sort of flight logs of the plane. Was there anything, did it make any sudden movements, or was there anything untoward about that? Or all of the previous flight paths. So you can map all of these in Google Earth in 3D and create a real representation of all of the evidence, and a real sort of mind map of it. And then this video emerged of a missile hitting a plane in the dark. You hear the explosion and you can see the plane carrying on ablaze. And so very quickly, it took us, I think, 15, 20 minutes, we were able to verify the street and the corner that was taken on. Christian, meanwhile, got on the phone to the person who uploaded it to that Telegram channel, was asking him questions. He said, "I heard an explosion," and then I just whipped my camera out and he captured the second explosion. So if you think back to those tweets, from people who are reporting it in the moment as well, 2 days before, it all starts stacking up. And we had calculated where the plane would continue its trajectory after it lost its signal from that first explosion. And this matched precisely. And it was about 25 seconds afterwards, we estimated, from the speed of the plane. So um, then you see the flash in the sky, and you hear the explosion 10.5 seconds later in the camera. And so because we have the position of the aircraft, we're able to calculate the altitude, but also the horizontal distance, and then therefore the hypotenuse, and how fast the sound would travel to the camera from the explosion. And all of that sort of added up as well, as doing some sort of like forensic frame by frame of the video to make sure that it's not manipulated. And so at this stage, Iran was still denying that they were responsible for shooting it down, and it was due to engine failure. And so, within the space of we typed that up really quickly, and within the space I think of about an hour and a half, we published, and then Iran admitted it the following day that they had shot it down. So again, it's like just stacking up, stacking nuggets and factoids and nuggets of information, and yeah.
And remembering lessons from calculus class in high school helps too.
Yeah, who knew how much comedians felt?
But that leads into a question from one of our students from UNM, University of New Mexico, down in Albuquerque, Daniel Ward, and he says, "What are some of the ways you've been able to see how all of your hard work has paid off?" And I know you just spoke about an impact of your story in Iran, which was truly extraordinary. But what are some other examples of some of the direct impact that your work has had in addressing any of these things?
Well, I think, I mean, there's, in one way, a lot of this is experimental, and there's other news organizations that are now taking it on. So that has been really gratifying to see, is that, and we ourselves learned from the human rights community, and were inspired by them in the early days of what we're doing, because Forensic Architecture, CT Research, Human Rights Watch, all of these groups had done some of this. Witness is another organization. So that's been good. But then in terms of direct impact of stories, like, I mean, although these are novel and innovative ways, because they're so rooted in evidence, they can have impact. And like one story that I did actually before I came to the Times, but then followed up at the Times, was the export of Italian weapons to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, and how they were being used in attacks on civilians. And Watana is a very good research, human rights research group on the ground, and that sort of evidence helped us as well. But by basically using ship tracking, bills of lading for the transports, monitoring where the ships and plane exports of these bombs went, and then looking at the debris in these attacks and seeing that these were made at RWM Italia, we're able to prove it, and then look at what Italian law and what European law says about that. And Italy suspended their exports last year of those weapons, which was kind of direct impact. Another one we did during the year was on how the Philly police, during a Black Lives Matter protest, basically corralled and kettled protesters and lobbed tear gas at them on a highway. And as they were trying to escape up the banks of the highway, they continued to tear gas them. And just very recently, I mean, that, although the local media there were covering that and creating pressure for it, the local authorities and the mayor didn't act until our investigation came out. And the same afternoon, they held a press conference, demoted one of the high-ranking police officers, and most recently, they have announced that they've banned less lethal munitions in that police force. There's a bunch of other ones as well that we could go through, like the Russia stuff. I think was held up in the Security Council and congressional hearings and stuff like that. Direct impact in Syria is very difficult to have, but yeah, you definitely can have impact.
Definitely. Well, I was going to ask a different question, but let's go back to the United Nations, and I'll pick up a question here from Rich Moriarty, who is on our program committee. And he says, "You said the United Nations initially sought to keep the Russian role secret and limited its investigations. Any theories on the motivations of the United Nations? Was it Russian pressure, US pressure, something else?
Well, we know from our reporting that the Russians pressured Secretary Guterres to keep the findings of that report secret. And in the end, we asked them questions about that. We wrote about that. We published our own investigation into it. And in the end, they did provide a fairly, not comprehensive, but like a longer than you'd expect, I think, executive summary of the report. But they kept the final report private. We don't have evidence that they tried to limit the scope, but it is curious that of the incidents that they chose, some of them were like they chose seven, and two of them were shellings by the opposition forces. I think three or four of them were by the Syrian, and one or two maybe by the Russians. And so I think it was only maybe one attack by the Russians, if I remember rightly. And given Russia's role, I remember being struck by that. That only one of the incidents that they were looking into was Russia, but also like because UN protected hospitals had been bombed so frequently, I couldn't understand why they weren't expanding the investigation to look at more of the hospitals. But anyway.
Let's pick up on that point around Russia, especially in a question here from Mike Marcotte, who's a professor of communications and journalism, also at UNM, and he asks, given Russia's knack for disinformation, in fact, I believe they invented the term disinformation, was there evidence of them covering their tracks and their involvement in Syria? Did you and your team at the Times have to ferret out false information from true information to triangulate what actually happened?
Yeah, great question. I mean, the Russians, completely denied involvement in the attacks. When Marat al-Numan happened, it was the death toll was so high and it was such an egregious attack that they had a press conference on it and they addressed it specifically and completely denied it. Russian aircraft weren't in the skies at the time, which is just false. And they do that all the time, just blankly deny it. They also, what they do sometimes is try to present evidence to support their denials. And so when a hospital is hit, they might, I remember one incident where they showed satellite imagery of the hospital and said, see, the hospital is here, it hasn't been hit. But actually, if you got that same satellite image and moved it over here, you would see that wing of the hospital actually had been attacked. But they're just selective and they try to use visual investigation methods to try to prove their point. One of the stories that we investigated was the chemical attack in Douma outside Damascus, again, where dozens of people were killed. And the Russian military police were among the first on the scene to cordon off the area. And they allowed access only to Russian TV in the days after that attack. It took weeks before Western media, and I think only CBS managed to get access to it. And in fact, the OPCW, which is the chemical weapons watchdog for the United Nations, they were hampered in getting in there as well, I think by a couple of weeks as well. And so, they very sort of carefully managed that site. They were able to in that instance because they took control of that area. But it's just another example of sort of how they try to cover things up.
Let's talk about technology for a second. I have a couple of connected questions here. One is from an early career journalist who wants to do what you do. What are some of the pieces of software or techniques one should learn and become comfortable with? And that connects to the second question from our board member, Tom Johnson. How do you stay on top of this rapidly changing technological environment, where you have to constantly explore, learn, and experiment with all kinds of different technologies? Let's talk about technology.
Yeah, to the first question, I would say a lot of the tools that are out there are actually free, available, and it's just kind of setting yourself up little challenges and practices to geolocate something, to chronolocate it. That means like find out when it happened. look at OSINT. It's, I've got a list, a Twitter list on my Twitter account called OOSI, which is Online Open Source Investigation. And it's all of the nerds like me out there who are doing this stuff and having fun with it, and solving these little puzzles. And some of them put up Thursday quiz time. And it just kind of gets you to practice these methods. And what I would say is, as you're doing that and as you're finding new tools, create your sort of digital dashboard, your virtual workstation, if you like. I use a tool called start.me, start.me, and it allows me to like have all of my bookmarks on anytime I open a new tab in Chrome, I have them organized by Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, satellite imagery, downloads, data scrapers, all of these different tools. And you just have them there, and it's a reminder of what's out there. Find ways like this. Henk van Es, for instance, he does workshops. Bellingcat do workshops on how to put these things into practice. And then in terms of like technology and staying abreast of that, I mean, we're always trying to push for innovative uses of available technology, not just for the sake of it, but to try to be more revealing about the evidence that we're collecting. An example of that would be, merging photogrammetry with drone footage and satellite imagery on an investigation we did into the shooting of a medic in Gaza. And we were actually able, by collecting over 1,000 videos and photographs of that day, and then droning the whole area, create a 3D model and put the 6 different videos of that gunshot, of that moment, into the model, show where people were, and then retrace. The bullet hit 2 people, so we were able to retrace the bullet back to the soldiers of the Israeli Defense Forces, and really examine, their justification for taking that shot in really technical detail, because we knew the minute, because we had collected all of this footage. We also knew the distance. We knew what was going on in the area at the time, because we had a video from all these different angles leading up to the moment. And so we literally had, although we didn't witness it ourselves, we were able to recreate it. And so it's just thinking about like, how can you use all of these sort of technologies that are coming out there and put them into practice. Now, it helps being at an organization like the New York Times that has the resources and will give you the time to do that. Like, that's not a luxury that everybody has, but it is possible to use these kind of lower tech tools as well to do equally revealing and impactful investigations.
Fascinating. There's a great question here. There's a lot of good questions here. So we'll ask just a couple more questions. I know we're a tiny bit over time, but this is from Scott Bunton, who's also on our board, and he asks, has any national government requested that your team provide evidence or information for its use in prosecuting a crime? Have you provided evidence or information to a national government for use in its own investigations?
Government agencies have, and police departments and human rights organizations have come to us afterwards, and we don't do that. We'll do our own investigation. We'll put the findings out there. We might write blog posts and do Twitter threads and that kind of stuff if we feel like there's other evidence that didn't make it in for storytelling purposes into the final product. But that has happened. We don't do it, and for good reason. There's, you want to maintain, a sort of a church and state separation, really, from any official organizations, and want to do your own investigation.
I guess a follow-up question would be, based upon your work, have governments taken action? Did the U.S. government take any action based on what you discovered about, Russian bombs in Syria, or have you seen an impact at that national or global?
Yeah, I mean, one investigation we did on an airstrike on a house in Taliban country in Afghanistan, the Afghan Air Force and the United States Air Force were denying it. Somebody had to do it. And so we investigated that. I mean, this is really awful that the father was living overseas, working and sending remittances home. He gets a phone call from his wife that there's a raid going on in the town, and next thing, his home, his wife, and all of his kids are killed in an airstrike. And he spends 6 months trying to get answers about what happened, who killed my family. He's getting stonewalled all the way, and we were able from. I mean, this is just the depth of knowledge that's in the Times. There's a particular um, uh, construction of bolts on a type of a JDAM, which is a precision guided missile that John Ismay, who's one of our former army, he was in the army. He's an expert. He worked at Amnesty for 10 years. He's an expert in military weapons. He was able to identify it, and that only the U.S. Air Force uses that. And so when we went back to them and pushed them, they originally denied it. But then when we had coordinates and other information, they admitted it, and then they launched an investigation into it. The Nigerian government launched an investigation into um, an incident where they killed dozens of unarmed protesters. The president, the what was the name? There was a particular wing of the army, the Presidential Guard, actually, sorry, that mowed them down during a protest about 2 years ago. And they launched that investigation. The State Department actually cited that because we were able to identify the military unit responsible. In Israel, the IDF launched a criminal inquiry into the shooting of that medic that I told you about, which was rare. They had launched, I mean, 5,000 people were shot that year by IDF soldiers, and only 3 criminal inquiries were launched, to my knowledge, and one of them was into Razan's shooting. So you with a platform like the Times, and when you do investigations that are irrefutable like that, they can force the hand of whatever relevant authority to investigate. Whether that changes anything or amounts to anything, I mean, it can amount to restitution in the case of the families of the passengers of the Ukrainian airline, or the Massi, the man from Afghanistan. Hopefully that'll happen for him. But yeah.
We know that journalists are persecuted all around the world. Do you ever feel fear or intimidation or receive threats for the work that you do, given how much of a discovery is in a lot of your work?
I mean, not our team, not really. Colleagues, yes, and colleagues in the field. I think in the political climate, even here in the US, it's crazy to say, but they've found it challenging to report on the election. I think it's just the environment that the states is in at the moment. But also, I mean, Dion Sarsi, when she went and interviewed a warlord in Central African Republic about Russia's involvement in the security assistance there. I mean, she's being interviewed with a gun being held to her head. So journalists go to great lengths. We're not in the field as much as many of our colleagues, particularly on the international desk, but it's something that we're aware of and we take very, very seriously. And we have a whole security team and apparatus and system around anytime we go into a sort of a hostile environment, and training that our colleagues must undergo before they're dispatched into the field, and all of that kind of stuff.
Well, last question, Malachy, and this has been absolutely fascinating, but can you give us a sneak peek of some of the stories you're working on now or the things to come?
Can't really, I'm afraid, but we were on election duty for a while. We're back to a couple of investigations now. They're related to um, race and policing, I suppose, is what you could say, in the US this year. But we'll, yeah, who knows? We have a couple of other things on the boil as well.
Mhm. Well, we're featuring your colleague Haley Willis next Wednesday at this time, along
Great.
with Alexa Koenig and Sarah Kalin from the Washington Post. And I was glad to see the Washington Post launch a very similar unit to what you guys have started at the Times. And
I
their
did.
piece on Lafayette Square, the clearing of Lafayette Square, was just staggering.
It was brilliant. Yeah, yeah, yeah. They did an amazing job there. Haley's brilliant. So yeah,
Yeah.
that'll be a good talk, I'm sure.
Well, that's a good plug for next Wednesday session at 1 o'clock. We're going to hear more about digital forensics and really get into issues that Malachy mentioned around collaboration. We have new newsrooms that are popping up that are built on the back of collaboration and technology, and smart folks having different tools at their disposal. It's fascinating stuff. Malachy, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it so much, and before leaving, you have to promise to come back to Santa Fe next year.
I'd be delighted to. Absolute pleasure, Sandy. Thanks for having us again this year.
Great. Thank you so much. I'll see the rest of you this afternoon at 5:30 with EJ Dion and Dana Priest. Bye for now.